Okay, so let's get started. For everyone who's watching on Facebook Live or through the Zoom link. So this actually is the first time we do it on Zoom. Usually we do Science and Nature Untapped over Teams. So this is new for us as well. So hopefully there's no glitches and everything goes really smoothly. So just to begin with the housekeeping, if you're watching in Zoom, if you have any questions, to put it in the Q&A rather than in the chat, that would be really helpful for us. We always love to know where you're from, so leave in the comments for Facebook or on Zoom, let us know where you're coming in from, and of course your questions, which we'll keep for the end of the presentation. I'm going to do a little countdown for Gabe from your TV, who records this, and this is presented on your TV in Cornwall a few times each month. So I'll just do a little countdown. So 3, 2, 1, Gabe, it's all yours. So hello and welcome everyone to Science and Nature Untapped, a free virtual monthly speaker series brought to you by the River Institute. My name is Stephanie Hildebrand and I will be your host for this evening. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that many of us are living on unceded land and traditional territory of Indigenous peoples. We are grateful for the opportunity to live where we do, and we thank all the generations of people who have continued their responsibilities to Mother Earth since time immemorial. You may have noticed that we don't describe a specific community, and that's because we know people are tuning in from, it's global now since it's live and it's virtual. If ever you did want to know whose territory you're living on or you're visiting your travels, I suggest you visit www.native/ a little line in the middle land.ca. So native line in the middle land.ca. And while I'm here, actually, anyone who's living in Cornwall or SDNG, there's going to be an event on Saturday. So what is that? June 5th at 2 p.m. It's 215 steps for 215 Indigenous children. We invite you to join us at St. Columban's Church, which is on 4th Street West. And there will be a walk all the way to the boat docks to the river. So the more people to come support, the better. If you're interested in learning more about the River Institute, what we do, the programs we offer, the research, you can follow us on River Institute on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. You can also find all of our presentations for Science and Nature at riverinstitute.ca/ontap. And if you were to go on YouTube and search River Institute, you should see our little icon and you'll be able to find all of our video content there. So for upcoming Science and Nature events on July 7th, we'll be learning about water, fish, community challenges and opportunities for post-pandemic science with Dr. Barry Madison, one of our own at the River Institute. So that's July 7th. And just as a reminder, again, it's the first Wednesday of every month from 7 to 8 p.m. for those watching online. So much of our programs are research, events, events such as Science and Nature are generously sponsored. So if ever you would like to support us with a donation, you can go to riverinstitute.ca/donate. And again, I say this at each one is, even just sharing our social media content. It goes a really long way. Talk to your friends about us. The more we talk about it, the more support we'll have. So thank you for that. So for tonight, we're going to be learning about permaculture, an introduction to going beyond sustainability with Audrey Wagner. She is currently studying a master's in science and environmental change and management at the University of Oxford in the UK. Her current research focuses on payments for ecosystem services and indigenous sovereignty in the Peruvian Amazon. Audrey hopes to go on to work on agricultural nature-based solutions to climate change and biodiversity loss, while empowering farmers to strengthen their resilience and livelihoods, particularly in Latin America. So thank you so much, Audrey, for joining us tonight. I know it's about midnight for you in England, so thank you again, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for that great introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So yes, I'm going to be talking to you all today about permaculture, and it'll be an introduction to going beyond sustainability. My name is Audrey. So I'll start just with a bit of a background about me. So I'm from Montreal, Canada, but I know that the River Institute is located in Cornwall, and so I have some family connections to Cornwall. My mom went to high school in Cornwall, and my grandfather, Lorenzo Murphy, who passed away in 2017, and who was much beloved by his community in Cornwall, was the social worker at the Cornwall General Hospital. And my grandmother, Francine, who we see in this picture over here, is still living in Cornwall and is watching this live. She was a French teacher in Cornwall. So happy to have those connections with the River Institute and any of you watching from Cornwall today. So I went to McGill University and I studied in the Faculty of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences, a bachelor's degree in sustainable agriculture. And so that really got me kind of going on the technical side of permaculture. And I did it through internships through that degree that really got me started and interested in permaculture. Right now, as Stephanie said, I'm studying in Oxford in the UK, a degree in environmental management. And yes, it is indeed midnight here where I am, but that's all right. I'm really happy to be with you all today. So when I was at McGill and in Montreal, I was the co-founder of 4 different organizations, all of them related to food and the environment, and 3 of them related to permaculture here. So it started with the McGill Permaculture Club, as well as the Permaculture Showcase Garden located in St. Anne de Bellevue near Montreal. And finally, the Macrogenerative Food Hub, which kind of integrated a network of a bunch of different initiatives in the area related to regenerative food, related to agriculture, and of course, permaculture. And so these pictures over here, which are the backgrounds for all of my slides, are all pictures taken from our events that we hosted with the McGill Permaculture Club from the garden that you can all go visit. It's open to the public in St. Anne de Bellevue. And I have to make it clear in my presentation today that I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants, so I didn't make, any of this up. This presentation is heavily based on the teachings of Graham Calder here. He's a permaculture teacher in Montreal and founder of P3 Permaculture. Another person who really inspired me to start my journey interested in food and environment is Vandana Shiva, a very famous Indian activist, environmental activist in India. And as well, when I was at McGill, I did a 4-month internship on a permaculture farm in Belize and was mentored by this man, Chris Nesbitt, who really taught me the ins and outs of permaculture for the first time. I then went on to take a permaculture design certificate course with Orania Gardens over here, and of course credit where it's due to the 2 co-founders of the permaculture movement back in the 1970s in Australia, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. So to the question of why we're all here today and what we're all asking ourselves, what is permaculture? What is this? So I like to kind of simplify it down and think about it in 3 words to start off. So as ethical, ecological, design. So if you're kind of trying to remember from this presentation, yeah, I went to this presentation on permaculture, and someone asked you, well, what is permaculture? And you're like, I don't really know. Just think these 3 words, ethical, ecological, design. And so essentially permaculture, and it could be, it's a kind of combination of permanent agriculture or permanent culture. It's a system of design based on the observation of nature to create human societies which are really beyond sustainable, which are abundant, and which are regenerative. And it's really based on the ethics of indigenous cultures and the principles of natural ecosystems. And it gives us the tools to respond to really the greatest challenges of our time, which is how to meet human needs. And these human needs can be food, can be shelter, can be community, can be all of our most essential human needs. How do we meet these in an ecological way? That's what permaculture helps us design. And it really seeks to work with nature instead of against it. So what we're trying to do is move beyond sustainability towards regeneration and abundance. And that's because when you think of the word sustainability, I mean, it really just is kind of staying at one level. And we've already made things, you know, a lot worse with the environment and ecosystems and stuff. Do we really want to just keep them at this, you know, not so bad level? What would you say, you know, if you said, oh yeah, my relationship with my sister is sustainable? No, we want to be regenerative. We want to be abundant. We want to make things better. So that's why we really want to go beyond sustainability to regenerate natural systems. And so the origins of permaculture have their roots in ecology, so kind of ecosystem sciences, looking at the links between, you know, different plants, different animals, the science of ecology, as well as systems thinking. So thinking about how all things are related, interconnected, feedback loops, this kind of thing. And it's also rooted in the teachings of various indigenous cultures from around the world. So these include the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, as well as First Nations people in North America, and many, many others. And what the co-founders of the permaculture movement really kind of learned from these indigenous communities are that they have a similar central ethics, and that are really based on reciprocity and a respect for nature. And from these ethics and from these kind of the teachings of these different communities, they developed these two co-founders developed permaculture theory and developed these permaculture ethics that we find right here. And so the three ethics of permaculture are, first of all, earth care. So care for the earth, care for the environment, for ecosystems, for animals, for different species. That one's pretty straightforward. But equally as important is people care. And often in conservation movements, people can really be left out of them. For example, in the creation of a national park, you know, in the past, especially, there tends to be a kind of movement towards, okay, people are bad, people are terrible, let's kind of put them all away and just conserve this natural pristine space. No, we're saying people are just as important, and we can't leave them out of this. And we need to design spaces that kind of integrate both people and well-being. And then fair share is a mix of both, where we have reciprocity towards the environment, equity for all people everywhere, and as well, we're sharing with nature. So if you have a garden and you have an apple tree and some deer take some of your apples, well, you know, you could say that's all right because I'm sharing with the deer. I don't need to kind of have all those apples for myself. I can share with these other species. And so really what we're thinking about is a paradigm shift from humans kind of being at the top of the food chain to them being more integrated and part of nature, and humans really as being part of nature. And interestingly enough, a lot of research has come about in the past decade showing how these areas that we previously thought of as pristine, so for example, the Amazon rainforest, was actually shaped by human interaction. And so the species composition, the different kind of tree species, coconuts, etc., Brazil nuts, all the different types of trees and even animals that make up this so-called pristine environment was actually kind of heavily influenced by indigenous peoples who lived there before. So what this tells us is that there is no really kind of pristine environment, and that we should not kind of romanticize these environments that have zero human interaction, and instead that humans can really kind of benefit the environment and I imagine that some people here have heard of ecosystem services. So these are the types of services that the ecosystems give to humans, and they can be, carbon sequestration to help mitigate climate change, as well as water filtration, as well as oxygen provisioning that trees give us. So these are all ecosystem services. But then there's also that can be flipped on its head and say, what kind of services can we provide to ecosystems? And there are quite a bit. And so what permaculture is about is working with nature to enhance these services that ecosystems provide, and kind of giving back to nature as well. And so what we want to do is we really want to be like squirrels, actually. We want to create abundance. What do squirrels do? Well, they go around and they look for nuts, and they bury these nuts, and often they actually forget where they've buried these nuts. And not all the time, but sometimes when these walnuts that these squirrels have forgotten, when they sprout and turn into a walnut tree, what the squirrels are doing is creating abundance, because these trees, this one tree that the squirrel accidentally planted, will give enough walnuts for not only just this squirrel, but generations and generations of squirrels after it. So can we be more like squirrels in creating abundance for people today and also people in the future? And so really kind of going back to this paradigm shift of from humans being kind of bad to humans potentially having a good positive impact, we talk about a lot about our carbon footprint, our ecological footprint. And what this kind of sounds like is, how can we be less negative? I always, we want to reduce our ecological footprint. We want to be less bad for the environment. And this puts us in a really kind of negative position where all we can do is be less bad. And can we flip that on its head, and can we have a positive ecological footprint? How many trees did we plant? How many people did we help? How many ecosystems did we regenerate? How many species did we save? How many rivers did we kind of conserve in our lifetimes? Can we measure it that way instead? So here it gets a bit into the weeds of the specifics of the permaculture principles. So there's 12 different permaculture principles, and I'll try to get through this a bit quickly here. But I think they're really nice in kind of illustrating what permaculture really is. So in the center, you have the 3 ethics. And then you have the 12 principles around that. And the first one is always observing. So the first thing we want to do is observe nature, observe natural systems. And then after we've observed them and we've understood them, we can then try to mimic them and learn from them and design systems that are similar in the way they work to the way that natural systems work. Because nature is tried and tested through years and years of millions of years of evolution. And nature has kind of evolved in a way that works. So if we mimic this, we have more of a chance of creating systems that work well. And in addition to this, what we want to do kind of specifically when we start a permaculture project is that we really want to observe the site that we're working on. We want to observe where the water flows, which spots are sunny, which spots are shady, which spots are wet, which spots are dry. Where do the kind of wildlife species like to hang out? Where do the humans like to hang out? What's the elevation? Observing all these different things through the seasons to make sure that we're designing a really context-specific and site-specific project. The second thing we want to think about, and the second principle, is to catch and store energy. So we want to harvest when this energy is abundant. And a great way to kind of a great example to think about is sunlight. Sunlight is abundant, and sunlight is energy. So can we use this energy when it's abundant? Yes, I'm talking about solar panels and renewable energy, but I'm also talking about, can we dry our herbs that we harvest on a sunny day instead of using, an electric oven, for example? Can we harvest water when it's raining instead of using water that's pumped from the groundwater? Think of these things when they're abundant and try to kind of capture them and store them so to use them when they're less abundant. Third, we want to obtain a yield. So I should have specified this at the beginning, actually, but permaculture is to design all sorts of systems. So we often talk about it in the context of agriculture, of food production, of gardening, but it doesn't only have to relate to that. It can also relate to designing a landscape for water management and flood prevention. It can be for designing a building, many different things that don't have to relate to food. But the reason why food is such an integral part of permaculture is because it's one of our most basic human needs, and we need to eat 3 times a day. And the food system globally has a massive impact on the environment, as many of us know. So obtaining a yield, making sure you're actually getting something valuable out of your project is important to kind of keep in mind, to not lose sight of the goal of meeting human needs through your different designs that you may be doing. Next, we want to self-regulate. So we want to be open to feedback. We don't want to just say, okay, here's our project, here's our plan, and just kind of drive forward and not have those kind of checks and balances, where we're open to feedback, where we're always checking, okay, we implemented this thing, does it work? And to really be open-minded in that sense. We want to use and value renewable resources. So taking advantage of sun and wind power, and not so much relying on scarce resources. We want to produce no waste. So from observing nature, we can see that there is no waste in nature. One creature's waste is an input for another creature, and there really is no waste. So can we mimic that? Can we input that into our systems? Can we create systems that are circular and where there is no waste? We need to try to do that to be sustainable and beyond sustainable. Let's try to design from patterns to details. So let's first look at the big picture, not get caught up by one little thing. I need this specific thing in my project. Let's first think about the big picture and then kind of hone in to the site specific and the little details about what we want to do. We want to integrate different systems together. So the more, the better. And another principle in a couple principles is diversity, but we want to integrate kind of human systems with nature, and we also want to integrate different farming systems, for example. So can you have animals with a vegetable production with a kind of arable field crop? Can you have trees with your animal production? Can you have sheep and pigs and chickens, as well as a walnut production? Can you integrate all of these things on one site? That's what nature does. Nature integrates all of these things together. It doesn't have monocultures all separated. We want to do slow and small solutions because the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And so we need to be resilient. And part of resilience means having a bunch of little small solutions here and there, to really make sure that we're secure, and that if something goes wrong, and if we miscalculated something, if something didn't go as planned, we're going to be okay. We really want to value diversity, and diversity can be a diversity of species, so of plants and animals, and for example, again, relating to agriculture, having many different crops, many different plants in your garden, but also diversity of people, diversity of humans, having people with different opinions, different political and cultural views, and different backgrounds coming together, because this creates resilience and leads to the emergence of new ideas and new thoughts. We want to use the edges. And so if we think about ecological systems, we can think of the St. Lawrence River, an estuary, where there's typically a lot of biodiversity in estuaries because they're at the edge. They're at the edge of land and water. They're at the edge of fresh water and salt water. And so being at the edge creates all sorts of interesting dynamics and more diversity. So we want to capitalize on that. And the last principle, number 12, is that we really want to self-regulate and kind of be open to new ideas and intervene in effective ways. So And so these are actually two principles that I like to add to the 12 principles. So every element should serve multiple functions, and every function should be supported by multiple elements. And so over here you have kind of one element that is serving multiple functions. It's making coffee and eggs and toast all at the same time, instead of here a monoculture that is just serving one function. So this wheat monoculture is providing wheat. It's providing a lot of wheat. We need wheat. That's good. Food is great, but it's just providing one. Can we have ecosystems? Can we have systems that provide more than one function at a time? And then we also want to think about systems that are resilient here. So if we think of how you're going to want to manage water on your farm, will you just have one centralized irrigation system? And if that system breaks, what will happen then? Do you have a backup? Or will you have a lot of different strategies that are working simultaneously to secure that you have enough and sufficient water on your farm? These can be different irrigation systems. These can be things for drainage. This can be having healthy soil, water, flood tolerant and drought tolerant crops, all at the same time kind of working together. That is an element or function, the function of water provisioning supported by multiple elements. And so we came from the ethics and then the principles. And now we're going to think a bit about the design process. So what do we want to do when we're designing? It could be your backyard garden. It could be your neighborhood farm, your big kind of commercial farm. So what do we want to do? We want to first observe. We then want to identify any missing elements, and we want to connect the inputs to the outputs to really kind of reduce that waste and close that loop. And then we want to replace the missing elements that are there. And so here I'll give some examples of what permaculture can look like and what it can really do to make things a bit more concrete for you. So here's the Greening the Desert project in Jordan by Jeff Lawton. And so it was in the Fertile Crescent, where an area that used to produce a lot of food. So naturally, kind of with the different climate zones, it can produce food. It's not a natural desert in a sense, but it became desertified through human activity. And so what this project has done is that they brought in different kind of missing elements. So what was missing from this? There was missing some organic matter, some leaves. So they brought in basically truckloads of leaves and created some shade for different plants to start thriving. And what happened was that the leaves really captured the moisture in the air, rebuilt the soil, and this essentially a few years later became a lush food providing forest. Over here, the Loess Plateau project in China was a desertified area because of human activity, and a few years later became this lush area as well by changing just a few elements of the system. The before and after pictures here. Again, another before and after picture. So this is using Alan Savory's mob grazing technique. So a desertified area that then became a lush grassland through changing the patterns of the cattle grazing over there. So the before and after picture over here. So let's think a bit, what's in our toolbox? We started with the principles, the ethics and the principles, and now let's look at some more precise strategies and techniques of what we can actually do concretely to implement some of these permaculture, to do permaculture. So let's think of water. What kind of strategies do we want to do with water? We want to slow it, we want to sink it, we want to really store it, and we want to save it. So there's different kind of techniques to use for this. One of them is called swales. So a swale here is essentially a trench that's dug in the soil. And it's dug on contour. And what that means is that it's basically level with the slope. And even if you think your land doesn't really have a slope, almost all land has a slope. And if you measure it, you'll see that it's actually there, even though it may not be, you may not be able to see it with the naked eye. So the water will run in some sort of direction across land. And what you're trying to do is really slow the flow of water so that it stays on your land, so that it doesn't run off, but it really soaks into the soil. And the soil is like a sponge. And what it does is it'll soak up too much water. So this will be great for flood prevention, but then it'll also release this in the time of not enough water in drought. And so this is a great way that's used very frequently in permaculture to store water and manage water on one's land. What do we want to do with soils? Well, we want to always keep them covered. And so we need to remember that soil is living, and that soil, it's really the soil microbes that are responsible for plant growth. So we need to feed them. And we want to build soil organic matter and soil carbon. So basically when a plant decomposes, it becomes, or it is organic matter, and then it becomes soil organic matter once it decomposes. And that soil organic matter is full of carbon. And of course, as we know, carbon is creating huge problems with climate change in our atmosphere, but it also helps with plant growth. So it's really great to kind of store it in the soil. And there's various global projects happening. And one of them is the 4 per 1,000 projects. And that says that an annual increase of 0.4% of the soil organic carbon stocks in the top few centimeters of soils would really kind of counteract the whole annual increase of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. So what it's saying is that if we increase the organic matter, the carbon content of our soils, it can store down a lot of the carbon dioxide that we're emitting, and it can help mitigate climate change. And it has huge potential actually to mitigate climate change. So it's really, really exciting. And it's kind of a win-win solution, because when you have more carbon in your soil, it's also a healthier soil that will store more water. It'll be more less compact and be better for the plants and animals in that ecosystem. Then with plants, what do we want to do with plants? Well, as we saw in our permaculture principles, diversity is resilience. So we want to plant as many different species as possible. And we want to look to nature. We want to observe nature. And what does nature do with plants? Well, there's this theory of succession. So after you have sort of a volcanic eruption, say, and what plants, will slowly colonize the area, or a forest fire, say, first you have your kind of annual plants, then you start having your perennial grasses, and then over time, especially if you have, the right rainfall, and kind of the Quebec, Ontario area are mostly this type of climate zone, it'll move to a mature forest. So essentially, in our kind of area of kind of the northeastern, Canada, eastern Canada, most ecosystems want to move towards forests. That was the natural vegetation before. What was forests. And so what we're doing with agriculture, though, with our fields, is that we're on the first stage here, where we're planting annual plants. We're planting corn, we're planting wheat. These are all annual plants here. And then we have weeds, and these weeds are perennials. And they're first hardy perennials, but then they're first annual perennials, but then you have the hardier ones that are perennial weeds. And then if you were to leave your land fallow, you would have shrubs. So essentially what nature is trying to do with your farmer's field is trying to push it into the successional phase. And so how can we work with nature instead of trying to always push it back? Well, we can plant such things that are called food forests. So we want to imitate kind of this climax, ecological climax community of forests with our systems. And this will create less work for us. And it's really kind of imitating what nature does. And so over here we have different layers of food forests that we can observe. When you go into a forest, do you see all the trees kind of all at one layer with nothing on the ground? No, there's a bunch of different layers. So you have your highest trees, and the lower trees, and then the shrubs, and you have your little grasses and nice wildflowers, and then the roots, the rhizosphere layer, and you have the vertical layer, the climbers. And so all of this can be kind of mimicked, but with edible species. So your tallest plants can be your walnuts. Your lower plants can be your apple trees, your cherry trees. Then your shrubs, blueberries, raspberries. Then you have your herbaceous layer, all your fun stuff that you know of, tomatoes, zucchinis, all of that. Rhizosphere, you can have carrots, potatoes, all of that exciting stuff. Your ground cover crops right on the surface, some clover to protect the soil, and your vertical layer as well, especially in the tropics. There's some really exciting vertical layer plants, vanilla that you can plant, passion fruit, lots of fun stuff. And so we're trying to create a food forest over here. Not in all cases, but this is an example of what we can do with permaculture, is looking at nature, looking how forests are kind of really the kind of successional phase of a lot of different ecosystems, and looking at the different layers and replacing the kind of typical trees that you would find in a forest, say, you know, your oaks and your elms, with some edible species, to be able to provide, not all forests, of course not, but, you know, say you want to make a food forest that provides food, you're trying to replace some of them with cherries and apricots and plums and peaches and apples and all these exciting things that we can eat that are more useful for humans. And that brings us to food. And so again, and really emphasizing that our goal to meet human needs while regenerating ecosystems. And why food is so exciting, and this is what really got me into food in the first place, is that food is the most direct and intimate way that humans interact with nature. So 3 times a day, food brings people together. Food is community, food is culture, food is nutrient cycling, and food is really what connects us back with the land. So that's why food is so important, and such an important thing to consider when we're designing different things and thinking about how we can improve the environment. And this is a question I get asked a lot. What is the difference between permaculture and agroecology? So essentially, permaculture can be seen as a specific way to practice agroecology, where agroecology can be considered as one of many tools used in the permaculture design theory. So I really got excited about food systems in agriculture because agriculture is both the biggest problem, but also the most promising solution. So it's such an interesting kind of spot where it's causing climate change, but it can also solve climate change. And it's also the sector that's the most vulnerable to climate change. Of course, when you have these droughts and these floods and these natural disasters, the first thing that gets affected is farmers' fields. But you also have a huge potential to solve climate change through things like sequestering carbon in the soil, doing agroforestry, planting trees on your land, doing better practices, more ecological practices, etc. And so this is a book called Drawdown, and it basically has the top 100 solutions to reverse climate change. And so we have some of the top candidates here. So in the top, I guess, top 50 or so over here, many of them relate to permaculture. So we have essentially, if we look at number 28 over here, multi-strata agroforestry, that's essentially what I was showing you with the different food forests, having those different layers, and the agroforestry, the different kind of edible tree species, etc. So essentially permaculture and a bunch of kind of related things like regenerative agriculture, tree intercropping, silvopasture, they're all kind of very much related and fall under the umbrella of permaculture. Not always, but often, all have are in the top 100 solutions to reverse climate change. And so so do you remember fair share when we talked about the ethics? One of the ethics was fair share. And so what we have typically in a natural ecosystem is that we have all these different ecosystem services, and the food for humans is quite low. And then if you look at intensive agriculture these days, we have all the other ecosystem services that are quite reduced almost to nothing, with the food production element maximized over here. And in the third one over here, what we have is, can we have all of them at the same time? Can we share with nature and have these ecosystem services at the same time as crop production. And I don't know if you've maybe noticed here, but you see that the crop production is a bit lower on this kind of one than the middle one. I would disagree with this. I would say that we can have just as much yield, just as much crop production while having the diversity of species and while providing all these ecosystem services. It's been shown in many different studies. If you have more diversity, the plants will complement each other, and in many cases can result in a higher yield if designed correctly, of course. And a question that I get asked almost every day, is it scalable? Is it scalable? Yes, of course it is. So one great example is Mark Shepard's New Forest Farm. And so he has a 106-acre commercial scale permaculture farm where he plants chestnuts and hazelnuts and apples, and he also grows walnuts and asparagus, and he integrates animals into the system. So he has cattle and pigs. And this system over here is so naturally where he lives, it's in the kind of mid-US, was not a forest. It was actually a savanna, a type of savanna, and so this is where he kind of mimics the natural system that was there before in bringing in the different herbivores like the cattle and the lambs, and the trees are more interspersed, as we can see here in the picture, where to really mimic what was there before. And we always think about, is it scalable, but does it actually have to be? We need to remember that 70% of the food produced worldwide still comes from small farmers, and there's nothing wrong with small farms. We can feed the world with small farms, and we need to remember principle number 9 over here, to use small and slow solutions, because slow and steady really wins the race and is more resilient while providing jobs for many, many people. So family farming is a huge part of the solution, and just because your permaculture farm or your permaculture garden is small does not mean that you're not making a difference, because once they're multiplied, it can make a world of difference. And so other things that permaculture can be used for, it's really very useful for urban design. And so there's one thing that really caught my eye in my permaculture design course that I love to use as an example is these desire lines. So if we look at the picture here on the right, we see that this was not really designed with a kind of observation, with the observation step in mind, because people have made their own paths over here, and I'm sure we've all walked in parks and across, you know, different kind of fields where it has this line that's it's so impractical to walk on the path. And so how can we design public spaces, parks, these kinds of things with permaculture in mind, to observe where humans like to walk and where are the desire lines on a piece on a plot of land and in a space. Permaculture also relates to energy and passive solar design. For example, there's these types of houses called earthships that use passive solar design and use like south-facing houses to use the sun's energy as much as possible, not only with solar panels, but really just the angle and the materials used to build the house. So this is also permaculture, thinking about all these different things and working with nature in a way that would be in the best way possible. And there's also a social permaculture movement that's very interesting, fascinating. I would encourage you to look at. There's eco-villages dotted around the world, and these things called transition towns as well, that use permaculture in their towns, and eco-villages that are built all around the principles of permaculture and integrate permaculture around the world. And here are some great books for you to check out. So just to close here, we can really reverse climate change. We can regenerate entire ecosystems, and we can even green the desert. It's been shown. So everyone has a role to play in this movement, whether it's talking about it, educating people, planting a garden, using a solar panel. So you find your role, and I'd love to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Audrey. That was a really enlightening presentation, and I imagine that a lot of people must have connected to it. And so yeah, thank you for taking it. Sorry, I'm sometimes looking the other way because I have two screens right now. But yeah, so thank you so much for taking the time to present to us today. And, you know, despite the time it is for you right now, it's quite late. And then I also want to let everybody know, in case you do want to rewatch this presentation, because I think there was a lot of really valuable information that you might want to look at again. We will be sharing this on our YouTube channel. So I will open up to questions, which I'm going to switch over and look at our chat and see. So we had a question I saw in our Facebook. So Kelly Cassie, she says, listening from Williamsburg, on a future mission to build our home here and apply permaculture basics to our homestead. And then she asks, what are your thoughts on replacing grass lawns with clover or mosses?
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I definitely have. I mean, I hate lawns. I mean, I think they're pretty ridiculous sometimes because they don't provide really any uses, right? So with permaculture, we want things to be useful. We want them to have multiple uses, and what use does a lawn have? Not much, right? So I think clover is really fantastic because it feeds the soil health. It sequesters it fixes nitrogen in the soil. So I'm a huge fan of replacing lawns with moss, with thyme, diversifying the species. It creates habitat for all these little insects that are super exciting. I had at my old house, I had a lawn that was made out of thyme. Took a while to establish, like years. But yeah, it's really fun to replace your lawn with more exciting things like clover. I would definitely encourage you to do that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of, you know, all the lawns and the amount of space that it takes and how much space that we could use to be growing food or things that will be more beneficial for the environment as a whole.
Exactly. There's a whole movement that's called Food Not Lawns, and I mean, they have great pictures on Facebook and great Facebook pages where, you know, it's just, let's try to imagine if all the suburban lawns were turned into gardens, all the food that we could produce, all the biodiversity that we could bring back, etc. Yeah.
I don't know if it's still the case, but I did see, you know, some municipalities asking people to, you know, get rid of their gardens in the, well, you know, if they had gardens that took over and they didn't have lawns. So there were like bylaws for having, you know, I guess larger gardens in the front or letting it grow a little bit more wild. And I'm hoping that changes and, you know, that we move forward from that lawn culture.
Yeah, I hope so too.
So I'm just looking at our questions to see if, Philip Ling, one of our a partner organization, he watches all of our Science and Nature Untapped presentations. He's a big fan. So hi, Phil. He says, thanks for the inspiring presentation. Are there any resources you can recommend in the Brockville, Eastern Ontario area?
Well, I'm not sure about that area in particular. The area I'm the most familiar with is Montreal, unfortunately. So I can definitely recommend a whole bunch of different kind of fun things in Montreal. One of them would be to look at the P3 Permaculture website. And so again, P3 is an organization founded by Graham Calder in Montreal. He's a permaculture teacher and consultant, so he can consult on people's, you know, lands, and their website has a whole bunch of really cool resources. And they have different like events and talks and workshops, that kind of thing. And as I mentioned, I would also encourage you, when, you know, the pandemic blows over a little more, to try to visit some of the fun projects happening in St. Anne de Bellevue. Those are the ones I'm the most familiar with. So there's the McDonald Permaculture Showcase Garden project that I co-founded there, but also a whole bunch of other different projects that are under the Macrogenerative Food Hub. And so some of these are like there's a food forest in Senville, as well as a bike path, a permaculture bike path in kind of Senville, St. Anne de Bellevue area as well. So yeah, that's the area I'm the most familiar with.
Excellent. Thank you. I guess it leaves a lot of room for people to start these projects, and
Yeah, I'm sure there are some. I'm sure there are some in that area. I'm just not familiar with them.
great. Now I'll be Googling after. I'm going to check it out for myself. Um, so I'm trying to go through this. So Jennifer asks, are you aware of any communities who have advanced to permaculture in lieu of lawns as models?
Who have advanced to permaculture? What was that? I didn't hear properly.
Who've advanced to permaculture instead of lawns as models?
Right. Yeah, well, I would really encourage people to look up the transition town movement. So it's a movement that started in a city in the UK, a town in the UK, and it's really been driven forward by Rob Hopkins, and he has a bunch of really cool like TED Talks and books and stuff and YouTube videos. And yeah, they're essentially towns where the whole town is encouraged to use different permaculture principles, among other things, and where they've really worked to kind of almost eradicate lawns and replace them by gardens and all their front yards, etc. And there was another book that I had on one of my last slides there that I absolutely love. It's called Sustainable Revolution, like with the R in brackets. And it has it's a really fun book because I think there's maybe like 30 to 40 different permaculture / eco village projects in there with a bunch of different pictures and stuff like that, and they're all around the world. So it's so fun to like flip through and just have it on your shelf. It's not the kind of thing that you read front cover to back cover, but really just to flip through and see, okay, what's happening in Thailand, what's happening in this country, and it's super inspiring.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all the resources. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm just looking over. The questions get shifted a little bit as they come in. So I'll give everyone just like a minute in case they have any more questions to send. So just give it a little bit of time for people to type them if they have any more questions. I guess for now, one of the comments that you made in the beginning and I thought was so important was talking about humans and how important they are as part of the environment, and the comment about like national parks and trying to keep it pristine and removing the people. And yeah, that really resonated with me. So thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of like discussion about that lately, especially with a greater acknowledgement towards indigenous people, and so that's really that discussion is very much intersected with indigenous rights. So I'm so happy that you did the land acknowledgement at the beginning of this talk, as you do with all of these webinars, because it's extremely important. As we know, and these communities we're here managing the lands long before we came, right? And they really had a more intimate relation with nature, and there was a lot of reciprocity involved that we still don't know that much about, right? So it's really fascinating and humbling to think about that and to try to kind of reconnect with that more and move back towards that. And there's one of my favorite books of all time is a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. Yeah, so she's really great in kind of thinking about how we can weave indigenous wisdom from the past into scientific teachings about plants and about ecology in the future. And so I think this book is really big amongst, she doesn't necessarily say the word permaculture, but this book is really, really big and popular in the permaculture movement. And so I would really recommend it to everyone. It's a really beautiful book as well.
Excellent. I am so happy you brought Robin Wall Kimmerer up, because that was exactly who I was thinking of, especially when you speak of reciprocity. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, I don't think we could recommend it enough to people.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm going to check the questions again. And if we don't have anything, we could yep. Okay, so I have a question. I think it might be from one of your friends, Yulia Clemento. So
Yeah.
she's asking, can you expand on hyperlocal economies as related to permaculture?
Yeah, of course, of course. Hi, Yulia. I'd love to. So again, I think hyperlocal communities, especially with relation to trade in permaculture, gets really important, because one of the issues I particularly experienced in Belize is, so I was on a permaculture farm there, and they were producing many different things, and so their overall yield on their land was bigger than they would have had they just produced, one or two crops, and they were producing hundreds of different things: vanilla, coconut, cocoa, coffee, a bunch of different things. But they were having a lot of trouble, I guess, making a profit off of this, because of the way our economies are structured, and because of the ways our economies today really favor economies of scale. And so even though they had an overall yield of all these different kind of crops put together was bigger, they didn't have enough of a single thing to really kind of market on the global scale. And this is why I think a great example of why these hyperlocal communities and economies are really important, to say, how can we kind of help each other with this dilemma that we're having, that the kind of global economy isn't a good kind of fit for these, what we need to be doing. What we need to be doing is planting diverse farms, diverse ecosystems, and there's a lot of disincentives for that, right? In the global economy. And so how can we create economies that create good incentives for that? And so I think it's been, done experimentally here and there, and I think these eco villages are really a great example. So I would say, like, point people back to those two different resources that I mentioned before, the transition towns, where they created their own currency for their town to be able to kind of keep the money and the different kind of resources hyper local in their community. And so they created this currency for their community to be able to use at like participating shops within the community, and this encouraged people to buy local and from their local bakery, etc. And I think various eco villages as well have done like similar things. So yeah, it's really fascinating to look at these different hyper local economies, hyper local communities, and see how each one, because they're also diverse and different, have decided to structure and design the way that they're going to function.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for that. And I'm just going to, I didn't want to cut you off, but I'll just say goodbye to everybody who's watching from your TV. So everyone, thank you so much for watching again. And we'll be back with a new presentation next month with one of our own scientists. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you in July. Great. So I'm going to come back to you, Audrey, see if there's any more questions. And so we got a comment from somebody. They said, good presentation. I love your positive energy. How do you see the permaculture movement as similar to or separate from the principles of sustainable development initiatives from decades ago?
So the principles of sustainable development from decades ago. So I'm not sure if the person is referring to kind of how the sustainable development agenda moved from the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, to now in 2015 the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think there's various kind of synergies and potential conflicts between the permaculture movement and the current SDGs, which I'll kind of reframe the question in talking about the SDGs here. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of synergies. For example, SDG number 15, which is life on land, encouraging biodiversity and yes, slowing species loss, of course, the SDG of countering climate change, of providing food, but there's also some potential conflicts. For example, the SDG of number 8, economic growth, that kind of, there's I didn't talk about this a lot, but I guess I did mention in my comment, in my response to Yulia's comment about hyperlocal economies, about how our globalized economic system is creating a lot of disincentives, right, for the kind of world that we want to live in. And so that kind of brings us to this whole discussion around economic growth, around how can we have finite growth, can we have infinite growth, sorry, on a finite planet. A lot of people would think that would say that we cannot. Some economists would say that yes, we can, because we can decouple economic growth from the material world, and that growth will be, you know, only from, you know, on the weightless economy, just through intellectual you know, thought and technological development. So this is a whole really big debate. But typically the permaculture movement has really kind of, traditionally taken the stance that no, we cannot live on a planet with infinite growth because of the environmental destruction that it causes. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of kind of interesting dilemmas that we have here. There's a lot of critiques about the sustainable development goals and sustainable development in general. Especially, you know, people have said that it's a form of neocolonialism, and as I mentioned a lot in my presentation, we really need to consider, not even consider, but prioritize the kind of traditions and worldviews that Indigenous peoples had and still have. And so a lot of, you know, potential conflicts there. However, overall, my personal opinion is that the sustainable development goals do point society generally in a right direction. I think it is important to keep on critiquing them, but I would not, you know, kind of say, oh, they're good for nothing, because I think it's good to have goals that point society in the right direction. Traditionally, the goal has just been economic growth, GDP growth. And with these new, you know, 2015 goals, we have the goal of stopping climate change. We have the goal of reversing desertification. We have the goal of, you know, ending poverty, of having people in good health. So all these goals are quite positive. Most of them are quite good. And so, yeah, I would encourage us to work together, the permaculture movement, with the sustainable development community.
Thank you, Audrey. And I guess to close that, and with one of a comment from one of our listeners, she says, "I love your action-based view of human footprint as being positive." Excellent.
Great. Yes, I would encourage you all to have a positive footprint and plant some trees, but plant them in the right spots and the right places, and do your research first.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Audrey. I think I haven't seen any new questions come in. So I think we'll just say goodbye to everybody who's watching live online through Zoom or Facebook. And we'll see you July 7th for the next Science and Nature Untapped. So again, thank you so much for giving us your time, Audrey, and for sharing your knowledge with us. And, you know, thank you so much. So have a
My
good
pleasure. Yeah, and please get in touch. Anyone who's watching, if you have any further questions or would like to talk, I'd be very happy to chat. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent. And is it, can I share your email address in the comments section on the Facebook?
Yeah, sure,
okay.
Sure.
Okay, excellent. So I'll, good night, everybody. Thank you.
Great.